We find ourselves this week in the midst of the high drama of the Joseph story. In part 2, Parsha Mikeitz. The Parsha opens with Joseph down in Egypt, having been sold into slavery by his jealous brothers. After being falsely accused by his master's wife, he finds himself in prison, where through his gift at dream interpretation, he eventually is released and called to Pharaoh's side to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. When Pharaoh describes 2 dreams in vivid detail, Joseph is able to see in the symbolism a message from God about the future of Egypt. He foretells a 14-year story of abundance followed by famine and advises Pharaoh to save up all of the grain for the next 7 years so that Egypt can survive the 7 lean years that are coming after. Stunned by his talent, his vision, and his relationship to God, Pharaoh appoints Joseph as his vizier over all of the land, enabling Joseph to save not only all of Egypt, but his own family as well, who soon will come from Canaan seeking sustenance. This is one of my favorite narratives in all of Torah, and over the years I've interpreted it in many ways. But this year it occurred to me that this story and the redemption that it both includes and portends might be impossible in our time, and not for the reasons you might think. It's true that many people today don't tend to believe that God is speaking to us through our dreams. But more fundamentally, Pharaoh and Joseph demonstrate capacities that are harder to come by these days. In fact, we seem to be losing some of the mental faculties that are on display in this story, and it is worrisome. What am I talking about? Well, first of all, Joseph's skill at dream interpretation developed from his own dreams in childhood, and then in practice with Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker down in the dungeon, and finally with Pharaoh himself. That means that all 4 of those characters dreamed vivid dreams and remembered them to tell them in detail in the morning. By necessity, therefore, at a most basic level, they all had adequate REM sleep. Something that can't be taken for granted anymore. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of all Americans have insufficient REM sleep on a regular basis. Sales of melatonin have increased 500% from 2003 to 2014, and over-the-counter sleep aids sales have doubled over the last decade. And scientists are finding that drugged sleep does not actually produce the same quality or quantity of REM sleep. Almost half of all Americans say they feel sleepy 4 to 7 days per week. And according to the National Institutes of Health, sleep deficiency is linked to many chronic health problems, including heart disease and kidney disease and high blood pressure and diabetes and stroke and obesity and depression. And sleep deficiency is also linked to a higher chance of injury in adults and teens and children, as well as impaired memory and dementia. According to the World Sleep Day statistics, as reported by CNN, the health of 45% of the world population is jeopardized by insufficient sleep. Now, as someone who has struggled with sleep ever since my children were born, I hate these statistics because they just make me more anxious, which is not helpful for trying to sleep. But we need to reckon with them. Something is going on, and it is not good for our bodies or our mental health or our memory or our cognition. There are many theories about why we're not sleeping enough, but one of them is that we are overstimulated. And that's a problem not just at night, but also during the day. I'm reading a book right now called Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention, the subtitle of the book, by Johann Hari. And in it, he chronicles how we have arrived at a time in which billions of people are interrupted by notifications and communications and distractions every few moments of every day. And he explores how we've become addicted to the devices that are stealing our ability to focus. And he documents how multitasking is actually not a real function of the brain. It is actually not. And therefore, all attempts to pay attention to more than one thing at a time reduce our ability to think deeply, to think creatively, to think effectively. And he demonstrates that workplace errors have increased exponentially from a combination of lack of sleep and distraction. And he makes the case, quite convincingly, that we are all walking around impaired, with only a fraction of our cognitive capabilities in effect. None of us are thinking right, and we don't even know it. And the people who design the devices and the apps that are addicting us to fragmenting our minds are aware that this is happening. And their business model depends on it. In our Parsha, Joseph discerns that a crisis is coming, and he presents a feasible solution to that crisis, averting it for the entire region. This requires insight, interpretation of metaphor, problem-solving skills, long-term planning, and effective communication. Pharaoh determines that Joseph's predictions should be heeded and then puts him in charge. This requires discernment, decisiveness, and effective delegation. How compromised would Joseph be if he lived in our time? Imagine an alternative storyline in which Joseph fails at any one of these functions. Unable to interpret the dreams, unable to translate the interpretation into a plan, unable to communicate that plan effectively. Imagine if Pharaoh was distracted by too many inputs and failed to act. We see all around us in our time a collective inability to make good decisions about the future. We see a failure to look beyond the news cycle, to plan appropriately, to prioritize among competing needs, to communicate in a way that engenders understanding, to focus on any problem long enough to get creative about solutions, to listen to those who are suggesting solutions with enough attention span to follow through and make decisions instead of flitting from topic to topic to topic, to read beneath the clickbait headlines deeply enough to take in the complexity of the world around us. Obviously, we are in a time when we cannot afford to be impaired like this, when the world is as complex as ever and the problems are existential. When Joseph is rushed up from the dungeon, Pharaoh says to him, "Shamati alecha lemor tishma halom liftoroto." I've heard about you, that for you to hear a dream is to tell its meaning. Now Rashi is quick to point out that tishma halom, hear a dream, that you hear a dream, doesn't mean hear as in a function of the ear, but hear as in pay heed to, pay attention to, understand. Just like when we say Shema, hear, O Israel, Adonai, our God, Adonai is one, we're not talking about our ears, we're talking about our minds, maybe our hearts. We're talking about using our minds to pay attention to something that is subtle and not obvious so as to understand it. Our understanding depends upon our capacity to pay attention. Our interpretation of events and our ability to act effectively in response to those events depend on our ability to pay attention, which is interrelated with our ability to sleep. I've also been reading and listening to Tricia Hersey of the NAP Ministry, and if you don't know her work, I highly recommend it. Yeah, there's some snapping going on over there. Hersey is a Black woman, theologian, writer, performance artist, and activist who links sleep deprivation with capitalism and white supremacy. Her new book, Rest is Resistance, is out now. And she says that the capitalism that comes out of chattel slavery is, quote, the same system that is driving the entire globe to exhaustion and a deep disconnection with our bodies and our minds today. She also says, rest pushes back and disrupts a system that views human bodies as a tool for production and labor. It is a counter-narrative. We know that we are not machines. We are divine. And this brings us to Shabbat and to Hanukkah. Here we are on the seventh day. Our people knew from the very beginning, God knew from the very beginning that rest was necessary for life. So necessary that it was built into creation itself. We have built our lives, our tradition, our religion around that idea and that rhythm, setting aside one in every 7 days to remind ourselves of our own exhaustion and the need to put down the tools of production, to remember what is most important and what is most conducive to life. If any people out there are set up to succeed at rest with the structures and practices already set up for us, it's us. We don't have to invent anything. We just have to follow the wisdom of our ancestors and our God. We could use this day every week to break our addiction to distraction and overstimulation. We could use this day every week to sleep and to recover who we really are. And in the spirit of Hanukkah, breaking our addiction to sleep deprivation and overstimulation and distraction would be an act of resistance on par with the Maccabean revolt. The dominant culture is harming us. It is actually killing us. In fact, in our time, this may be the form of resistance that would be most significant to our quality of life, to our health, to social justice, and to the possibility of making decisions that give our grandchildren a future. Everything depends on our ability to think. So let's reimagine Shabbat as a day of resistance, when we take back our God-given right to rest and build the power to break our addiction to distraction and overstimulation. And when we light our candles for these last few nights of Hanukkah, that is something worth our dedication. Shabbat Shalom.